gases. It's things that move through the system. And people don't realize often when I talk to them about fluids, I'm not just talking about water, I'm talking about clean water. Because a fluid that isn't clean is not going to function in the way that is necessary, that we need it to function, as is clean air. If we don't have clean air, we're not going to have what we need in terms of a healthy environment. So the fluids that move through the environment are very, very important. And they are effectively the foundation of the other three sustainable issues here, which are the foods, the fibers, and the fuels. And foods obviously are something that we use for personal and human nourishment, but fauna uses it. You know, every living creature uses food for nourishment, and most living creatures, save ourselves, become nourishment for other creatures themselves. So food is really a function of both flora and fauna, or a product of flora and fauna. Fibers are basically, for most of the history of the world, fibers have been natural fibers. Up until about 100 years ago, maybe a little more, fibers became synthetic fibers. And so we're just beginning to grope with what we do with fibers and how fibers begin to affect the environment in which we place them. Prior to synthetic fibers, virtually every fiber that was created had a way to get back into the ecosystem without causing any significant harm to the entire system. Today, with synthetic fibers, and more currently with nanotechnology, we're beginning to see impacts on the environment that we could not have possibly anticipated in the past. And I give a whole course on, or not a course, it's a lecture on the whole issue of nanotechnology and how nanotechnology has both, is a double-edged sword. It both has tremendous potential benefits, but potentially has many, many unintended consequences. And fuels, obviously, most of our fuels up until about 200 years ago were carbohydrate-based fuels, basically wood and burnable carbohydrates. And then we decided we found some fossil fuels and began to use fossil fuels. And another good way to look at that is we began to look at what was banked in the account of the earth and started using banked fuels, which were banked for a reason in terms of the system of the earth, the Gaia system, as James Lovelock calls it. They were banked for a reason. They were sequestering carbon. And in fact, that function was keeping the air clean. So it was related to the first of these, the fluid called air, making that air clean through a process of sequestration. Our needs for these obviously are pretty obvious, but in terms of fluids, we need air. We can live only minutes without clean and fresh air. We can live for 2 to 10 days without water, depending on the temperature of the environment in which we're operating. The longest known people have been about 10 days that actually live without fresh water. We can live from 3 to 25 weeks without food, and then we begin to break down. Gandhi lived for 3 weeks without food before he went back to eating food. So it gives you some idea as to the level of intensity or importance of these elements. Fiber and fuels, those are more subjective. We can go without fiber and fuel, again, depending on where in the world geographically and what the environment is like in which we're operating. So if you're looking at fluids, there's been a lot of work done in the last several years that deals with the issue of fluids. I've read a lot of books, and these are 3 that I recommend. The most recent that's just been published by Charles Fishman, The Big Thirst, is probably one of the best, frankly, because it talks about the embedded water in so many products that we have. How much water do we need if we build a nuclear plant, which is something that people don't think about. How much water is embedded in the lettuce that is grown in California, then shipped by aircraft to New York for dressing on a sandwich in a delicatessen. It's a lot of water that's being moved literally with a lot of intense energy from a dry part of the world where it shouldn't probably even be grown into a wet part of the world to basically embellish a sandwich. And so you begin to look at some of those systems and question the logic of those systems from a holistic perspective. When the Rivers Run Dry, which is done by Fred Pierce, the center book, is also a really good book talking about the idea of how we have mismanaged water for very personal reasons at the expense of the Commonwealth. And I think you're beginning to see, at least I am beginning to see, perhaps selectively, more language about the Commonwealth. What is really owned by the common population as opposed to owned by the private sector. Perhaps with regard to water, one of the biggest issues here is bottled water and the ownership of water rights for the bottling of water, which creates private profit. And that's a contentious issue, which is coming up not only in parts of the world like India, where it's caused some significant repercussions, but it's coming up in parts in the United States as well. Local community groups are really fighting the establishment of water plants in places like California and even in places like Ohio and New York. Nestle's, which is one of the biggest bottled water companies, has had a lot of trouble setting up sites because of the fact that even with all their guarantees, they're using in excess of the allocated water for their business and at the expense of the community's water health. And foods, these are two graphics that were done by a gentleman named Christopher Jordan. And I would highly recommend, if you want some great graphics, he's got a couple of websites where he looks at the impact of things like fishing and hunting and energy. These are two demonstration graphics that talk about the tuna industry and the shark fin industry. And you can't read the little subsets there, but you know, there's the 270,000 shark are basically killed every day for their fins, which is an enormous number of shark. If you think every day fishermen are taking 270,000 shark, cutting off their fin for shark fin soup, throwing the rest of the fish in the water, that's a form of, you know, fauna genocide, frankly. It's ridiculous that we should, you know, allow, from a policy perspective, that kind of industry to exist. And that's what's going on. And, you know, it's hard to believe some of these numbers when I read them. You know, every day, every 4 days, less than a week, 1 million shark are taken. Not for the whole shark, but just for the fin. And so that's really very problematic. Some of the books that I would, the one there, Sushi Economy, is the one that I think really tells a story about how we have begun to effectively industrialize, privatize the food supply in ways that are really counterproductive in the long term. The Sushi Economy was a juxtaposition of the airline industry creating a capacity to move fish from initially the northeastern part of the United States to Japan on return flights, because people were flying from Japan for business and they had a lot of empty planes going back. And so a couple of employees from one of the airlines in the Northeast created a container which could refrigerate fish and keep it very fresh for 24 to 48 hours. They set up a system whereby they could take a catch of live tuna and get it to Japan before that tuna was dead. And they were getting, at the time, and this is already over 20 years ago, they were getting $30,000 for a good-sized tuna in Japan, fresh caught from the North Atlantic. To the point where they basically fished out the North Atlantic. The bluefin tuna no longer, you can't really, now you have to go down to the Gulf shore to get the bluefin tuna. And that is just moving around the world where they're fishing out the most desirable fish for sushi, of all things. And I don't know if you saw the, you know, so, you know, we've now got sushi bars in hotels in India. Because sushi is an elitist kind of food in certain sectors of societies. And it begins to beg the question of what is the value of something if you destroy it in a very short time frame? You've basically delocalized foods. Everything becomes an international food because people are demanding certain elite foods in society. There are other things. This is a Jordan, done by Christopher Jordan, and it's not tongue-in-cheek. It's a juxtaposition of some ideas in terms of a logo for Monsanto and its GMO foods.